I want to know the exact story, what you did to them. I want to know what they said. I want to know how you killed them. And I want to know if they knew what was happening to them. I want to know what they felt. I want to know if they hurt. Answer me! Answer me! Answer me!
Greetings, ghosts. This is Poetry Taught Poorly, where we teach you everything around poetry, on poetry, in poetry, albeit poorly. So today we're going to be talking about edge and edginess with a capital E. We will be looking at the highly praised and highly controversial work of a poet whose work has been described as morbid and depressing, and the poet herself being described as a young woman apparently obsessed with pregnancy, abortion, menstruation, and murder. Today we will be looking at the edgiest and sharpest poet, Ai Ogawa. Now, when I say Ai Ogawa can be considered an edgy poet, let me give you a couple lines from her poems that'll help you understand what I mean. I smell its piss odor in my underwear. Laughing, I snap my fingers. Rape, murder, I got you in the sight of my gun. I catch you by your braids, drag you to the cooking fire, and push your head in it. The wharf has a tight, deep vagina of water, and I'm gonna fuck it till it novas. So you can see she's a bit confrontational. She's a bit edge. She's a bit cutting. And you can see from her titles the topics that really interest her. Poems like Tired Old Whore, Childbeater, The German Army Russia 1943, Penis Envy, The Corpse Hauler's Elegy, Hangman, The Killing Floor, The Mortician's 12-year-old son, and more. Call now at 1-800-EDGY-POET. That's 1-800-EDGY-POET. Call now. So why did Ai Ogawa become obsessed with writing about pregnancy, abortion, menstruation, and murder when there's so much happy topics in the world? Why choose those? Well, like all dark heroes and villains, she has a traumatic backstory within her that likely spurred on the creation of these dark poetic monologues that focused on the perspectives of perpetrators and victims that would become the hallmark of her poetry. This was the dark and far from charmed life of Ai Ogawa. In the 1940s, a young woman spent another night out with a handsome Japanese man she had met named Michael Ogawa. And though they shared laughter and a bed together, this man was not her husband. After many discreet affairs, she soon discovered that she was indeed pregnant. Her first reaction after the panic subsided was to throw herself down the stairs and hope the child within her would die before she hit the last step. When her husband found out about the affair, he beat her, beating the unborn child within her as well. The young woman was taken in by family before moving to Texas, and she soon began to labor at a local hospital. From the complications of love and the 2 acts of violence perpetrated by both her mother and stepfather, a child named Florence Anthony was born. Sometime after, Florence's mother became pregnant again, but again doubting the child was his. Her stepfather punched the mother right in the stomach, killing Florence's sibling before they could ever meet. Florence's mother finally left the husband for good and married Sutton Hayes. When Florence was a child in San Francisco, her family never had enough money, and her stepfather would go down the street and borrow some. He'd buy a hamburger and cut it in half for her and her new sister for supper. Sometimes he'd spend the whole day borrowing money, and by next morning he'd gotten some Polish sausage and grits. But most of the time they had SOS, or shit on a shingle. While they were good times, they were always eclipsed by bad times. Bad times always around the corner. In Catholic school, she was given the assignment in English class to write a letter from the perspective of a martyr. Imagine the suffering and emotion of a victim before their unjust death. 2 years later, she began writing regularly. Florence Anthony would undergo multiple name changes from Florence Anthony to Florence Haynes until she finally legally changed her name to Ai Ogawa. Ogawa being the last name of the man that was her true father, and Ai her chosen name, meaning love in Japanese. Another important thing to note is that Ai Ogawa was self-described as half Japanese, 1/4 Black, 1/8 Choctaw, and 1/16 Irish. Being from a multiracial identity and also an ever-shifting self-identity, and also dealing with the violence within her family and within poverty, it is not surprising that the overall identity of her poetry is one of shifting identity, where she often adopts different personas, being placed in extreme and often uncomfortable situations. So trauma fueled the trauma of her poetic work.
That this world and all its people are diseased. Free will is a myth. Religion is a joke. We're all pawns, controlled by something greater. Memes. The DNA of the soul.
Now, before we enter the darkness of Ai Ogawa's poetry, I really want to preface the difference between edginess and transgressiveness. In the past, edgy used to just mean boundary pushing and shocking. Now, edginess kind of has a negative connotation associated with it. Edgy art is seen as being superficially dark, and its primary goal is just to shock and rattle the viewer without having a deeper message behind it. Transgressive art is seen as having those dark and shocking boundary-pushing elements, but having a deeper meaning behind it. Now we are about to jump into the deep end of Ai Ogawa's poetry, so we are going to look at really dark, really edgy poems right now. So disclaimer, if you are not ready at this point in time to listen to poems that deal with violence towards children, please skip to this time frame. In that time frame, we'll be talking about dark and violent poems of Ai Ogawa's that are perhaps easier to stomach. If you are willing to listen, so let's steel ourselves and jump right in.
Childbeater. Outside, the rain pinafore of gray water dresses the town, and I stroke the leather belt as she sits in the rocking chair, holding a crushed paper cup to her lips. I yell at her, but she keeps rocking. Back, her eyes open, forward, they close. Her body somehow fat, though I feed her only once a day. Reminds me of my own just after she was born. It's been 7 years, but I still can't forget how I felt, how heavy it feels to look at her. I lay the belt on a chair and get her dinner bowl. I hit the spoon against it, set it down, and watch her crawl to it, pausing after each forward thrust of the legs. And when she takes her first bite, I grab the belt and beat her across the back until her tears, beads of salt-filled glass, falling, shatter on the floor. I move off, let her eat, while I get my dog's chain leash from the closet. I whirl it around my head. Oh, daughter, so far you've only had a taste of icing. Are you ready now for some cake?
Unholy moly. Nothing edgier than Pavlovian conditioning your daughter to hate food because you got issues. This poem drifts from the transgressive to the more edgy side of things, can be particularly found in the last 2 lines of the poem. So you have the mother whirling the chain around her head, coming up to the kid, approaching them and says, "Hey, oh daughter, so far you only had a taste of the icing. You ready now for some cake?" For me, that just seems cartoonishly over the top. All these bad things together, I can kind of buy. But just to imagine the perpetrator saying those 2 really strange lines to me, it just really threw me out of the experience. This is what that cake line sounds to me.
This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me.
It makes me think this is more edgy than transgressive, and when I try to think of a meaning in it, it's really hard. I'm just like, wow, like beating your child, you should not do that, and you definitely want to protect children in childhood. That is more of a self-created reasoning rather than one suggested by the poem or pointed by the poem. It's kind of like it said, here's really shitty things, make a meaning out of it. I want to take a second to defend the Childbeater poem. defend its right to be edgy. Now, we live in a violent world, and sometimes we see things happen that don't, at least on initial view, seem to have a point. Awful and inhumane things occur almost every day that we have a hard time justifying or understanding. And it's often hard to find some moral lesson within it. And there are people that commit these evil acts with almost unclear or dubious motives.
You gonna wash your hands? No, 'cause I'm evil.
So perhaps this poem is an exercise in trying to help you find the meaning of this violence. And I do want to say, by making the child voiceless and enduring these horrible, horrific, almost over-the-top acts, you can't help but feel a great sense of empathy towards that child. Now, the debate has been ongoing for a while about if or should we make the depictions of violence useful, and I'm going to use the words of Robert Applebaum here. People object to violence in art as Susan Sontag objected to Pulp Fiction, because they don't see the moral usefulness of it, when instead the violence seems morally harmful or just plain useless, gratuitous being our usual word for the latter. But even the gratuitous may have its uses. Excess, as the philosopher George Bataille often argued, is vital to us. Excess is vital to our moral health. Feeling not just indignity, but also shock, frustration, disgust, pity, and terror, or uncomfortable joy. So perhaps violence in the excess state may have a purpose, and we shouldn't be completely dismissive of pure edge.
The Good Shepherd, Atlanta, 1981. I lift the boy's body from the trunk, set it down, and push it over the embankment with my foot. I watch it roll down into the river and feel I'm rolling with it. Feel the first cold slap of the water, wheeze and fall down on one knee. So tired, so cold. Lord, I need a new coat. Not polyester, but wool. New and pure like the little lamb I killed tonight. With my right hand, that same hand that hits with such force, I push myself up gently. I know what I'd like. Some hot cocoa by the heater. Once home, I stand at the kitchen sink, letting the water run till it overflows the pot. Then I remember the blood in the bathroom, and so upstairs I take cleanser, begin the scrub, the tub, tiles, the toilet bowl, then the bathroom, mop, vacuum, and dust rag. Work for the joy of it, for the black boys who know too much but not enough to stay away. And sometimes the girls too. How their hands grab at my ankles, my knees, and don't I leap them like a good shepherd. I stand at the sink where the water is still overflowing the pot, turn off the faucet, then heap the water and sit down. After the last sweet mouthful of chocolate burns its way down my throat, I open the library book, the one on mythology, and begin to read. Saturn, it says, devours his children. Yes, it's true. I know it. An ordinary man, though, a man like me, eats and is full. Only God is never satisfied.
In the Good Shepherd poem, which is based on the Atlanta child murders of 1979 to 1981, we are in this poem from the perspective of the serial killer after having disposed of another child victim. He's routinized this awful thing he does, and he's fully dehumanized his victims. And then you have him with this God complex almost, where he says, oh, don't I lead them like a good shepherd? Which is a reference to the Bible where Jesus kind of compares himself to a good shepherd tending to his sheep. But this Bible verse is corrupted by the serial killer. Now, where I think this poem transcends its edge into transgressiveness in the last couple lines where he pulls out the mythology book on Saturn and says, when I eat, I'm full, but God is never satisfied. So first off, it's an interesting rationale of this terrible person trying to justify their behavior, saying, you know, it's kind of God's fault that I exist in the first place. It transforms the poem from just talking about a serial killer into a poem that is actually about the question of the existence of God. Or maybe not questioning the existence of God, but perhaps questioning the benevolent nature of God. If God existed, why did he allow me, this horrible serial killer, get away with all these murders? And isn't God worse than me, the serial killer? Because when I kill people, I kind of feel a sense of satisfaction and I don't need too much more. But when God takes life, it almost seems endless. So I think the meaning here is more explicit than with the Childbeater poem and angles you towards that direction. And I feel that this poem is more transgressive than the Childbeater poem because of that. Now that we've finished looking at the poems from the perspective of the murderers and awful people, and we are going to look at 3 poems from the perspectives of victims and see how Ai captures this in her bold and transgressive way.
Abortion. Coming home, I find you still in bed, but when I pull back the blanket, I see your stomach is flat as an iron. You've done it as you wanted me you would, and left the fetus wrapped in wax paper for me to look at. My son. Woman, loving you no matter what you do. What can I say, except that I've heard the poor have no children, just small people, and there's room only for one man in this house.
If we look at the poem Abortion, we can see a really complicated relationship going on between this husband and wife from the perspective of the husband. Now, regardless of the reasoning behind the abortion, perhaps it was justifiable in some sense because they are poor, or other reasons unknown because we are seeing this from the perspective of the husband, you cannot help but feel the animosity and hatred that this wife has for the husband in the fact that she openly displayed the fetus wrapped in wax paper to the husband for him to find, knowing that the husband wanted this child. So you can't help but feel that this was a purposeful, almost mocking act. Now, we know from the last poems, the perpetrators like to justify their actions. Well, victims also justify why bad things happen to them and why people treat them in these horrible ways. So for the husband, he's like, okay, you know, I love you. You know, you're my wife. I love you no matter what. And we're poor, and poor people shouldn't have children. And also, or poor kids don't really have childhood, so it'd just be like raising another man in the house. So he clings onto like a masculine idea of being in charge of a household and the idea that they're too poor to say, this is why my wife openly did this terrible thing to me. Now, this is kind of relatable to us as well. Just think of your ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, or any friend you had in the past who did something absolutely terrible to you, but you tried to justify it in ways that, oh, you know, they care about me, they like me, they do this or that for me. They might not, in fact, be as caring as you think they are.
Starvation. Rain, tobacco juice, spit from the sky shatters against your body as you push the pane of glass through the mud. The white oak frame of the house shakes when I slam the door and stand on the porch, fanning myself with a piece of cardboard cut in the shape of a ham. There's a pot of air on the stove. You drove 70 miles, paid for that glass, and I can't remember the last stood meal I had. But bring it up here. I'll help you. I'm not angry. We'll paint the sun on it from the inside. So if we die some night, a light will still be on. It's hell to starve in the dark. I don't know why. I'm just your woman, like you. Crazy to lose all I've got. It's rotten, you know. Rotten. A table's set. What time is it? Wash your hands first. You're late.
looking at another dysfunctional relationship, because if you haven't noted, Ai Ogawa loves horrible dysfunctional relationships. Instead of a bad or at least complicated wife, we now have a bad husband who, instead of buying his wife food, decides to instead buy a pane of glass for their house. The wife and the husband suffer from some sort of delusion. The wife is pretending things are all right, cooking up a good hot stove of air,
Finally, some good f***ing food.
and fanning herself with cardboard ham. And we don't exactly get the reasoning behind why the husband bought the glass, but clearly doesn't make sense since they seem to be not very well off. But an interesting reaction, I think, that the wife has is not being angry. Just like in the abortion poem, the husband wasn't angry. Both of these victims here are passive, which I think is a bit strange, because if my mom was in this situation and my dad didn't buy her food, she would get very hangry and probably beat his ass. But here, she just tries to make the best out of the situation and say, I'm just gonna let's paint the sun on this, so it will be bright and cheery, even though that's not a real sun. It's not bright and cheery, and no matter how they try to mask it or pretend with their delusions that things are good, they are in fact not. And we have all been in situations where we try to pretend that the bad thing that's coming is not going to happen because we'd rather not face the truth.
Cuba, 1962. When the rooster jumps on the windowsill and spreads his red gold wings, I wake thinking it is the sun and call Juanita, hearing her answer, but only in my mind. I know she is already outside, breaking the cane off at ground level, using only her big hands. I get the machete and walk among the cane until I see her lying face down in the dirt. Juanita, dead in the morning like this. I raise the machete. What I take from the earth, I give back and cut off her feet. I lift the body and carry it to the wagon, where I load the cane to sell in the village. Whoever tastes my woman and his candy, his cake, tastes something sweeter than his sugar cane. It is grief. If you eat too much of it, you want more. You can never get enough.
To provide some context with this poem, Cuba in 1962 was actually the Cuban Missile Crisis, and around that time, Cuba was also under an embargo. So conditions weren't exactly pleasant for the Cuban people. But this poem talks nothing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, or directly the embargo in general. It's just sort of an implication saying this is the timestamp of where we are in history. I guess what's interesting here is that the victim is trying to make his grief and sadness affect others. He's like, I want everyone to know about it, and I want everyone to be affected by this death as it has affected me. So, although this image of first cutting off a woman's legs and then putting in a sugarcane patch to sell in the town is completely out there, completely wild, it makes such a stunning connection with grief. And I think this is where edginess or transgressiveness can work. Without the ability to push the boundaries, we wouldn't have gotten to this metaphor that captures grief and the tragedy of loss so beautifully. All these three victim poems have their darkness and edginess, but there is something phenomenal happening here. So within all three of those poems, you see that there's the one very clear act of violence. One is the purposeful starvation of the wife. Second, the showing off of the fetus. Third, the chopping off of Juanita's legs. Despite that being the immediate burst of violence going on in the poem, there is an underlying violence, a structural violence that is occurring within the poem. So there is a double violence occurring. In the Starvation poem, he buys a pane of glass to beautify their home despite being broke as heck and they're starving. Why does he do that? Is he trying to maintain an ideal that was told to him by society? Is he trying to create an image of himself, of success, of wealth? Why is he doing this? If those values or ideas cause you to starve yourself and your wife, what good are those values? Those values are violent. So Ai Ogawa is doing a lot of smart and good work by expressing an immediate violence and the violence that precludes the main one that we see, underlying violence that is not as readily seen, but still as deadly. Underlying violence, explicit violence. Underlying violence, explicit violence. Underlying violence, explicit violence. We have a cultural value in Western society that the aim of life is happiness, and suffering is a condition to be overcome, cured, dismissed, or suppressed. So despite this value that we have, we still suffer, we still see suffering, and we still treat others in ways that are sometimes awful and wrong. Ai Ogawa wrote her poems because she wanted people to see how they treated each other and themselves. So perhaps Ai Ogawa's poetry and maybe even other edgy works should be used as a mirror. Instead of being grossed out at what you see in that mirror, maybe reflect on why what we see is ugliness, violence, and cruelty. You and I cannot live an unexamined life. Thank you for watching Poetry Taught Poorly. If you like what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing. I hope your day does not end violently in any way. Have a nice day, and I will see you guys later.